Patience Thornwell's hands did not shake from fear as she stood against the papered wall of the grand dining room at Merrick's Cradle. They trembled from the weight of what she had done, from the knowledge that coursed through her veins like ice water on this frigid December evening in 1839. Before her, the Merrick family sat arranged around their mahogany table like portraits in expensive frames, Master Cornelius at the head, his wife Abigail to his right, their 3 children scattered along the sides, and visiting brother Edmund positioned nearest the crackling hearth. 7 souls in total. 7 bowls of venison stew steaming in the candlelight of Albemarle County, Virginia, where winter had come early and unforgiving. Patience watched Abigail Merrick lift the first spoonful to her thin lips. Time seemed to slow, the way it does when a person stands at the edge of an unfathomable precipice. The silver spoon, the very type of spoon that had cost Patience everything 3 months prior, caught the firelight as it rose. Patience's breath stopped in her chest. Her fingers, clasped before her stained apron, pressed white against each other. The arsenic she had mixed into that stew the previous night in the cold cellar had dissolved completely, invisible as original sin, bitter as the tears she had wept into her empty cabin after they took her daughter away. Abigail's lips parted. The spoon entered her mouth. She swallowed. Nothing happened. Not immediately. Patience knew it wouldn't. She had read the instructions on the rat poison tin by stolen candlelight, had measured and calculated with the same precision she used for her cooking, the skill that had made her invaluable to the Merricks for 15 years. Arsenic did not announce itself with immediate drama. It was patient, like her name. It waited, building inside the body like a poison tide. "Patience, you may serve the bread," Abigail said, her voice carrying that aristocratic clip that had always reminded Patience of scissors cutting fabric. Cold. Efficient. Final. "Yes, mistress." Patience's voice emerged steady, a small miracle. She moved to the sideboard where the bread sat wrapped in linen, still warm from the kitchen ovens. Her legs felt distant from her body, as though she were watching herself from somewhere high above, a ghost observing her own living form committed this unspeakable act. Cornelius Merrick cut into his stew with the edge of his spoon, releasing steam that carried the scent of venison, carrots, potatoes, thyme, and beneath it all, imperceptible to everyone but Patience, death itself. He was a large man, Cornelius, with matonchop whiskers the color of rust and hands that had signed the bill of sale for Cleo without hesitation, without mercy, without even looking Patience in the eye. "Edmund, you must try this," Cornelius said to his brother. "Patience's cooking is the finest in 3 counties. I'd wager my best horses on it." Edmund Merrick, younger and leaner than his brother, smiled and raised his own spoon. "Then I shall not disappoint." He tasted, nodded appreciatively. "Magnificent, Cornelius. You weren't exaggerating." Patience distributed bread to each place setting, moving around the table like a shadow. 16-year-old William Merrick, the eldest son with his father's build and his mother's calculating eyes, barely acknowledged her presence. 12-year-old Margaret, delicate and quiet, offered a small smile that Patience could not return. And 8-year-old Thomas, the youngest, pushed his stew around his bowl with evident displeasure. "I don't like it," Thomas announced, his voice carrying the petulance of a child who had never known consequence. "It tastes wrong." Patience's heart lurched. She forced her face to remain impassive, but inside her chest, panic bloomed hot and terrible. Had she used too much? Could the child taste what the adults could not? "Thomas, don't be difficult," Abigail said sharply. "Eat your supper." "But mother, it's bitter." "Something's wrong with it." Cornelius set down his spoon with a heavy sound that made Patience flinch. "Boy, you'll eat what's put before you and be grateful for it. There are people in this world who would kill for such a meal." The word "kill" hung in the air like smoke. Patience stood frozen by the sideboard, the bread basket clutched in her hands. Her mind raced backward to the cellar the previous night, to the moment she had stood over the great pot of stew and poured the white powder from the rat poison tin into the bubbling liquid. She had stirred it clockwise, then counterclockwise, watching it disappear into the depths. She had whispered Cleo's name with each rotation of the wooden spoon. Cleo, her daughter. Cleo, 14 years old, with her father's quick smile and her mother's skilled hands. Cleo, who had been sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi because overseer Douglas Burke had planted a silver spoon in her apron and accused her of theft. Burke, who even now sat in the overseer's house at the edge of the property, who would receive his own portion of poisoned stew delivered by young Samuel from the stables, because Patience's vengeance was thorough, because Burke's cruelty had been the hand that destroyed her world, even if Cornelius Merrick's signature had been the weapon. Patience. Cornelius's voice cut through her reverie like a blade. My son says the stew tastes bitter. What do you say to that? She met his eyes. They were the color of muddy water, flat and unreflective. I seasoned it as I always do, Master Merrick. Thyme, sage, black pepper. Perhaps the venison was gamier than usual. Perhaps. He studied her with an expression she could not read. Though in 15 years, I've never known your cooking to be anything less than perfect. The compliment felt like an accusation. Patience lowered her gaze in the practiced gesture of submission she had perfected over decades of enslavement. I do my best to serve the family well, master. And you do, Abigail interjected, having finished nearly half her bowl. Thomas is simply being contrary, as children are. The stew is excellent. William and Margaret murmured agreement, both eating steadily. Edmund had already requested a second helping, which Patience provided from the tureen she had placed on the sideboard. As she ladled the poisoned stew into his bowl, she felt something like sorrow. Edmund had always been kinder than his brother, had once intervened when Burke had raised a hand to strike her for burning bread. But Edmund was still a Merrick. Edmund still owned people. Edmund had said nothing when Cleo was sold, had been visiting that very day, and had looked away when Patience collapsed weeping in the kitchen doorway. Kindness among monsters was still monstrous. Tell me, Patience, Cornelius said, and something in his tone made her skin prickle with warning. You've seemed different these past months. Quieter, if such a thing is possible. Is something troubling you? She could feel all of their eyes on her now. The candles flickered. Outside, winter wind rattled the window panes like skeletal fingers seeking entrance. In the fireplace, a log split with a sharp crack that made Margaret jump. No, master, Patience said. Nothing troubles me. It was the most enormous lie she had ever told. Everything troubled her. The empty space in her cabin where Cleo used to sleep. The silence where her daughter's humming had once filled the kitchen. The letters she could not write because she had never been taught to read or write, the distance of 600 miles that might as well have been 6,000, the absolute certainty that she would never see her child again in this life. Good, Cornelius said, though his eyes suggested he didn't quite believe her. Because you are valuable to this household, Patience. Irreplaceable, even. I would hate to think you were considering anything unwise. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Patience bowed her head. I know my place, master. Do you? He wiped his mouth with his napkin, having consumed most of his bowl. Because sometimes I wonder if any of you truly understand the order of things. The natural hierarchy that God himself ordained. Patience said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not damn her. So she stood in silence as the Merricks ate their poisoned meal, as the arsenic settled into their stomachs and began its invisible work, as the grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the seconds toward their collective doom. Thomas continued to complain sporadically, but under his father's stern glare, he managed to finish most of his portion. Margaret ate delicately, as always. William consumed his with the appetite of youth. Abigail and Edmund both had seconds. Cornelius finished his bowl and sat back in his chair, satisfied. Bring coffee, he commanded. And that apple cake you prepared this morning. Yes, master. Patience turned toward the door that led to the kitchen passage. Wait. She froze. Behind her, she heard Cornelius push back his chair, heard his heavy footsteps cross the floor. She felt him approach, felt the heat of his presence at her back like a furnace. "Before you go," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "I want you to taste the stew. Just to be certain. Since my son found it bitter." The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed to quiet its crackling. Patience turned slowly to face him. Cornelius stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the family watched with varying degrees of interest, Abigail with narrowed eyes, Edmund with mild curiosity, the children with the thoughtless attention of young people observing a scene they didn't fully understand. "Master?" Patience's voice came out smaller than she intended. "You heard me. Taste it. Take a spoonful from the tureen there and eat it. If it's good enough for my family, it's good enough for you to sample." This was the moment. This was the precipice. Patience understood with crystalline clarity that this was a test, that somehow Cornelius suspected that his mind, cunning in the way of men who controlled other human beings, had sensed something amiss in the order of his carefully constructed world. She could refuse. She could run. She could confess. Each option spiraled out before her in branches of possibility, and each ended in her death. But if she refused or ran or confessed, they might find the antidote in time. They might save themselves. Burke might survive. And then the retribution would fall not just on her but on every enslaved person at Merrick's Cradle, collective punishment for her individual act. Patience thought of Cleo. She thought of her daughter's face the morning Burke had dragged her away, the way Cleo had reached back toward her mother with desperate hands, the way her screams had echoed across the plantation grounds. She thought of the 3 months since, of the silence that had replaced her daughter's presence, of the empty half of the cabin that grew colder each night. She walked to the sideboard. She lifted the ladle. She filled a spoon with the poisoned stew, her final creation, her masterpiece of vengeance, her terrible gift to the Merrick family. And then Patience Thornwell, enslaved cook of Merrick's Cradle plantation, brought the spoon to her lips and swallowed death. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our macabre stories. Comment below what you think happened next. 3 months earlier, September 1839. The kitchen at Merrick's Cradle belonged to Patience in the hours before dawn. In that sacred darkness between night and morning, when even the roosters still slept and the overseer had not yet begun his rounds, the kitchen was hers alone. She moved through the space with the confidence of 15 years' mastery, knowing without looking where every pot hung, where every spice jar sat, where the knives rested in their wooden block like sleeping metal children. This particular September morning carried the last whispers of summer heat, though autumn lurked just beyond the horizon. Patience had risen at 4, as always, and now at 1/2 the hour, she worked by candlelight to prepare the day's bread. Her daughter Cleo stood beside her, 14 years old and growing into a woman's body with a child's hopeful spirit still intact. The girl's hands moved through the dough with increasing skill, kneading in the rhythm Patience had taught her since she was old enough to reach the work table. "Mama, you think Mistress Abigail will let me help with the preserves today?" Cleo asked, her voice soft in the pre-dawn quiet. Patience smiled despite herself. "Maybe. If you finish the morning potatoes without complaint." "I never complain about potatoes." "Child, you complain about potatoes every single day." Cleo's laughter was like bells, light and genuine. It filled the kitchen with something that felt dangerously close to joy, and Patience allowed herself this small moment of happiness. She had so few of them. Here in this kitchen, with her daughter beside her, with work that she had grown skilled at, with the small dignity of being called the best cook in 3 counties, this was as close to peace as an enslaved woman could find in Albemarle County, Virginia. The peace would last another 4 hours. By 9 that morning, the household had awakened. Patience had served breakfast to the Merricks in the formal dining room, soft eggs, bacon, the bread she and Cleo had prepared, fresh butter, coffee that Cornelius Merrick drank black and hot. She had returned to the kitchen to find Cleo washing the breakfast dishes, humming a song Patience's own mother had taught her decades ago, before she herself had been sold away to another plantation and lost to Patience forever. The kitchen door opened. Douglas Burke filled the doorway. Burke was not a large man, but he carried himself with the aggressive posture of someone who needed to prove his authority constantly. At 32, he had been overseer at Merrick's Cradle for 5 years, and in that time he had earned a reputation for cruelty that extended beyond even the accepted brutality of his position. He had cold eyes the color of creek stones and a mouth that seemed permanently twisted in a sneer. "You," he said, pointing at Cleo. "Come here." Patience felt her stomach drop. "Mr. Burke, is something wrong?" He ignored her, keeping his gaze fixed on Cleo. "I said come here, girl." Cleo dried her hands on her apron and walked forward, confusion written across her young face. "Yes, sir." Burke reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something that caught the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. Silver. A spoon, ornate and expensive, part of the Merrick family's formal silverware set. "Found this in your cabin this morning," Burke said. "Hidden under your bedding. You want to explain how it got there?" The accusation hit Patience like a physical blow. "That's not possible. Cleo would never." "I wasn't talking to you." Burke's voice cracked like a whip. "The girl can speak for herself." "Well? You been stealing from the master?" Cleo's eyes went wide with terror. "No, sir. I never took anything. I don't know how that got there, I swear before God, I never." "Lying now, too." Burke turned the spoon over in his hands, almost casual. "Master Merrick takes a dim view of theft, girl. A very dim view." Patience stepped forward, her heart hammering. "Mr. Burke, please, there must be some mistake. Cleo knows better than to steal. She's a good girl, she works hard, she never causes trouble. She caused trouble the moment she took what wasn't hers." Burke pocketed the spoon again. "Master will want to see her. Now." What followed was a nightmare that Patience would replay in her mind every night for the next 3 months. The walk across the plantation grounds to the main house, Cleo trembling beside her, Burke's hand gripping the girl's arm hard enough to leave bruises. The summons to Cornelius Merrick's study, that wood-paneled room that smelled of tobacco and leather and power. The presentation of the evidence, the silver spoon, produced like a prosecutorial exhibit. Cornelius had listened to Burke's account without expression. He had looked at Cleo with the same detached interest he might show a horse that had gone lame. He had not asked for Cleo's side of the story. He had not acknowledged Patience's pleas for mercy, for investigation, for simple justice. "I will not tolerate theft in my household," Cornelius had said finally. "It sets a poor example for the others. If one is allowed to steal without consequence, all will follow. Order must be maintained." "Master, please," Patience had begged, her dignity abandoned in the face of maternal terror. "Please don't punish her. I'll work double, I'll do anything you ask, just please. The decision is made, Patience. Your daughter will be sold. I have already contacted a broker in Charlottesville. There is a cotton plantation in Mississippi seeking young workers. The sale will be finalized by week's end." The words had not seemed real. Mississippi. Cotton. Sold. They were abstractions, impossible things that could not touch her daughter, could not rip apart the small world they had built in their shared cabin, in the kitchen where they worked side by side, in the stolen moments of laughter and song. But Cornelius Merrick's words became reality with the terrible inevitability of a storm rolling across the Virginia Piedmont. For days later, on a Thursday morning that dawned clear and mockingly beautiful, a man arrived with chains and a wagon. Patience was in the kitchen when she heard Cleo scream. She ran. Ran in a way that enslaved people were not supposed to run, with desperate abandon and no thought for consequence. She reached the main yard to find Burke holding Cleo's arms while the slave trader fastened shackles around her wrists. The girl was sobbing, calling for her mother, pulling against the restraints with the useless strength of a child against an unmovable world. Mama. Mama, don't let them take me. Please. Patience tried to reach her. Burke stepped between them, his hand raised in warning. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. She didn't steal anything. Patience screamed, tears streaming down her face. You planted that spoon, you monster. You wanted this. Why? Why? Burke's expression was answered enough. Because he could. Because Cleo had been pretty and growing prettier, and perhaps he had made advances she had rebuffed, or perhaps he simply enjoyed the exercise of his power. The why didn't matter. Only the result mattered, her daughter being lifted into the wagon, her daughter's voice calling out, her daughter's face disappearing down the long drive of Merrick's Cradle. Patience collapsed in the dirt of the yard. She heard her own voice making sounds that did not seem human, animal noises of grief too profound for words. She felt hands on her shoulders, other enslaved people trying to lift her, trying to comfort her, but there was no comfort to be found in a world that could legally separate a mother from her child for the crime of existing without freedom. That night, Patience lay in her cabin staring at Cleo's empty bed. The silence was absolute. The space where her daughter had been felt like a wound that would never heal, a phantom limb that ached with every breath. She did not sleep. Instead, she stared into the darkness and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The compliance that had kept her alive for 37 years, the submission that had been beaten and threatened and starved into her since childhood, it cracked like ice on a warming river. Beneath it, something else emerged. Something cold and patient and utterly without mercy. The weeks that followed were a study in silent transformation. Patience cooked and cleaned and served with the same efficiency as always. She spoke when spoken to, obeyed every command, showed no outward sign of rebellion. But inside, she was changing. Inside, she was becoming something the Merricks could not see and would not recognize until it was far too late. She learned where the rat poison was kept, in the storage shed behind the main house, accessible if she timed her movements carefully. She observed the household's rhythms with new attention, noting when guests might visit, when the family would all be together, when help would be far enough away to matter. She paid attention to Burke's schedule, to his habits, to his routines. And she waited. In early December, Edmund Merrick announced he would visit for Christmas. The family would all dine together on Christmas Eve, a grand meal to celebrate the season. Abigail Merrick instructed Patience to prepare something special. Venison stew, she requested. The master's favorite. Yes, mistress, Patience had said. It will be my finest meal. It would be. She would make absolutely certain of that. On the night of December 23rd, Patience waited until the plantation slept. She slipped from her cabin across the frozen ground to the storage shed. The lock was simple, she had stolen the spare key weeks earlier from Burke's office. Inside, among the tools and supplies and implements of plantation maintenance, she found the tin of rat poison. White arsenic powder, manufactured by a company in Richmond, labeled with skull and crossbones and instructions for killing vermin. She took it to the cellar beneath the kitchen. There, by candlelight, she stirred the poison into the great pot of stew she had prepared that afternoon. She stirred it clockwise, then counterclockwise, watching the powder disappear into the rich brown liquid. She whispered Cleo's name with each turn of the spoon. She felt nothing, no triumph, no fear, no hesitation. She felt only the cold certainty that this was justice, however terrible. That if the world could take her daughter and call it legal, then she could take their lives and call it righteous. Patience returned the rat poison tin to the storage shed. She went back to her cabin. She lay down on her bed and, for the first time in 3 months, she slept without dreams. Tomorrow, the Merricks will eat. Tomorrow, they will die. Tomorrow, Patience Thornwell would have her reckoning. Don't forget to subscribe if you love these chilling historical horror stories. Tell us in the comments, was this justice or murder? December 1839 arrived at Merrick's Cradle with a cold that settled into bones and refused to leave. The Virginia Piedmont turned gray and brittle, the landscape stripped of color save for the evergreens that dotted the property like dark sentinels. Ice formed in the water buckets each morning. The enslaved people of the plantation moved through their tasks with hunched shoulders and breath that steamed in the frigid air. Patience moved through those December days like a woman possessed by singular purpose. She was no longer the grieving mother who had collapsed in the yard 3 months prior. She had become something harder, something forged in the cold furnace of her loss. The other enslaved people noticed the change. They saw it in her eyes, in the way she held herself, in the silence that surrounded her like a cloak. Samuel, the stable hand who had worked at Merrick's Cradle since before Patience arrived, watched her with growing concern. He was 43, with graying hair and hands gnarled from decades of labor. He had buried 2 wives and 3 children, sold away before their time. He knew grief when he saw it, but he also recognized something more dangerous in Patience's transformation. "You carrying something heavy," he said to her one afternoon in early December as she walked past the stables toward the main house. "Something that's gonna break you if you don't set it down." Patience paused. They stood alone in the space between buildings, the winter wind cutting across the open ground. "Some things can't be set down, Samuel. Some things have to be carried through to the end." "That sounds like a woman planning something foolish. Or necessary." She met his eyes. "Did you know Burke planted that spoon? That Cleo never stole anything." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I suspected. Burke's been looking for an excuse to hurt you for years. Ever since you rejected his attention. So that was it." Patience had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the rage burn hotter in her chest. Burke had destroyed her family because she had refused to let him touch her. Because she had said no to a white man who believed he had the right to any black woman's body he desired. "Then you understand," Patience said quietly. "Why I can't let this stand. I understand wanting justice. But Patience, there ain't no justice for us in this world. Only survival. You do something rash, and we all pay the price. I know." She looked away toward the main house, where smoke rose from the chimneys. "Which is why you need to keep your distance from me, Samuel. From this moment on, you don't know me better than any other cook on any other plantation. You understand?" His face creased with worry. "What are you planning?" "Nothing that concerns you. Go about your business. Tend your horses. When the time comes, make sure you're nowhere near the main house." Before he could respond, she walked away, leaving him standing in the December cold with dread settling over him like snow. The days narrowed toward Christmas. Abigail Merrick had planned an elaborate celebration despite the lack of outside guests. Edmund's visit was occasion enough for festivity. She ordered Patience to prepare a feast for Christmas Eve dinner, the venison stew, roasted duck, candied yams, fresh bread, apple cake with cream, and all manner of side dishes that would showcase the plantation's abundance. Patience accepted each instruction with quiet efficiency. "Yes, mistress. It will be ready. See that it is. My brother-in-law has refined tastes. I want him to see that we maintain standards here at Merrick's Cradle." Standards. The word tasted bitter in Patience's mouth. Standards that allowed children to be sold for fabricated crimes. Standards that permitted overseers to assault enslaved women with impunity. Standards built on human suffering and called it civilization. On December 22, Patience began her preparations in earnest. She sent young Ruth, a girl of 16 who worked in the laundry, to fetch supplies from the storage shed. Ruth was sweet-natured and trusting, too young to recognize the dark current running beneath Patience's calm exterior. "I need you to go to town tomorrow," Patience told her. "Tell Mistress Abigail I sent you for extra cinnamon and nutmeg. Take your time. Stop by the dry goods store, the fabric shop. Don't hurry back. But won't you need help with the cooking? I'll manage. Consider it a small kindness, a few hours away from this place. Take the long road. Enjoy the walk. Ruth's face brightened with surprised gratitude. Thank you, Patience. You're always so good to me. The girl's innocence was cut like a knife. Patience forced a smile. Go on now. And Ruth? Whatever you hear happened here on Christmas Eve, I want you to remember you were in town all day. You didn't see anything. You didn't know anything. Confusion flickered across Ruth's face, but she nodded and left. Patience watched her go, grateful that at least one innocent would be spared proximity to what was coming. That night, December 23rd, Patience prepared the venison stew. She worked alone in the kitchen after the evening meal had been served and cleared. The fire in the great hearth cast dancing shadows across the walls. Outside, wind howled around the corners of the building, rattling shutters and moaning through the eaves like a chorus of the dead. She had hunted the ingredients with the same care she always did. The venison had been butchered that morning, dark meat from a buck Samuel had shot 3 days prior. The vegetables came from the winter stores, potatoes, carrots, onions, turnips. She added herbs from the dried bundles hanging from the kitchen rafters, thyme, sage, bay leaves, rosemary. She built the flavor in layers, each addition calculated to create the rich, complex taste that had made her famous among the county's plantation owners. The stew simmered for hours, filling the kitchen with aromas that would have made any mouth water. Patience tasted it periodically, adjusting the seasoning, adding a splash of wine from Cornelius Merrick's cellar, a pinch more salt, a grind of black pepper. It had to be perfect. It had to be her masterpiece. No one could suspect. No one could taste anything amiss until it was far too late. At midnight, when the house slept and even the other enslaved people had retreated to their cabins against the brutal cold, Patience made her final addition. She retrieved the rat poison tin from where she had hidden it beneath a loose floorboard in the pantry. Her hands were steady as she opened it, revealing the white powder inside, arsenic trioxide, tasteless when dissolved, odorless, deadly. The tin's label warned that death from arsenic poisoning was agonizing. Patience had no illusions about what she was inflicting. She knew the Merricks would suffer. She knew children would suffer. This knowledge sat like a stone in her chest, heavy and cold, but it did not stop her hands from moving. She thought of Cleo as she measured the powder. Cleo's face on that last morning, streaked with tears and terror. Cleo's voice calling for her mama. Cleo's hands reaching back, reaching always back, as the wagon carried her away toward a Mississippi cotton field where 14-year-old girls were worked until their bodies broke and their spirits died. Patience poured the arsenic into the stew. She stirred it clockwise 7 times, watching the powder disappear into the dark liquid. Then counterclockwise 7 times. The number 7 for the 7 members of the Merrick household who would eat this meal. The number 7 for the 7 deadly sins that had built the institution of slavery. The number 7 for the 7 generations of her family who had lived and died in bondage. With each stir, she whispered, "This is for Cleo. This is for my daughter. This is for every child torn from their mother's arms. This is for every woman violated. This is for every man worked to death. This is for every soul who died in chains. This is for justice, however dark." When she finished, the stew looked exactly as it always did. Rich. Hearty. Perfect. She covered the pot and carried it to the cellar where it would stay cool until tomorrow's reheating. The cellar was dark and cold as a tomb. Appropriate, she thought, for a meal that would create tombs of the bodies that consumed it. Patience returned the poison tin to its hiding place. She cleaned every surface she had touched, leaving no trace of her work beyond the stew itself. She washed her hands 3 times in water so cold it made her fingers ache. Then she banked the kitchen fire, extinguished the candles, and walked through the December darkness back to her cabin. The cabin was empty. It had been empty for 3 months. It would remain empty for whatever time she had left, hours, days, however long it took for the law to catch her and hang her. She had no illusions about her fate. When the Merricks died, there would be an investigation. There would be questions. And eventually, all roads would lead back to the cook who had prepared their last meal. Patience lay down on her narrow bed. Above her, through gaps in the roof, she could see stars scattered across the winter sky like ice chips. She wondered if Cleo could see the same stars from Mississippi. She wondered if her daughter still thought of her, or if the brutality of cotton plantation life had already begun erasing the memory of the mother she had lost. "I'm sorry, baby," Patience whispered to the darkness. "Sorry you'll grow up knowing your mama was a killer. But maybe you'll understand someday. Maybe you'll know I did it because loving you was the only thing that made this life bearable, and when they took you away, they took my reason for staying alive. So I chose to make my death mean something." She closed her eyes. For the first time in 3 months, sleep came easily. She dreamed of Cleo as a small child, laughing in the kitchen, her hands covered in flour, her smile bright as summer sunshine. In the dream, Patience held her daughter close and refused to let go, even as Burke's voice called from somewhere distant, even as chains rattled and wagon wheels creaked, even as the world tried to tear them apart. In the dream, Patience held on. And in the morning, Christmas Eve morning, she would serve death on silver platters and call it justice. Subscribe now to hear more dark tales from America's haunted past. Comment what you would have done in this situation. Christmas Eve, 1839. The taste of poison stew lingered on Patience's tongue like a promise kept. She had taken only a small sip when Cornelius commanded her to taste the meal, just enough to satisfy his suspicion, not enough to kill her quickly. The arsenic would make her sick, certainly, perhaps violently so, but she had calculated the dose in her own spoonful carefully. The Merricks had consumed bowls full. She had swallowed barely a thimble's worth. The difference between death and survival measured in teaspoons. "Satisfied, master?" she asked, setting down the spoon with a hand that did not shake. Cornelius studied her for a long moment, his muddy eyes searching her face for deception. Finding none, or believing he found none, he nodded curtly. "Return to the kitchen. Bring the coffee and cake as I ordered." "Yes, master." Patience bowed her head and retreated from the dining room, leaving the Merrick family to their fatal feast. In the kitchen, she stood with her back against the closed door, her heart hammering in her chest. 20 minutes, perhaps 30, before the first symptoms would manifest. She had time to brew coffee, to slice the apple cake, to arrange everything on serving trays with the meticulous care that had defined her work for 15 years. Time to prepare for the moment when her careful vengeance would reveal itself in screams and convulsions and the unmistakable realization that death had been invited to their Christmas table. Her stomach already felt uneasy, a faint burning that she knew would intensify. She ignored it. Whatever suffering awaited her was nothing compared to what the Merricks had earned. Patience set the coffee to boil. She sliced the cake with precise, even cuts. She arranged everything on the silver serving tray that Abigail Merrick insisted upon for formal meals. Through the closed door, she could hear the murmur of dinner conversation, the clink of spoons against china, the ordinary sounds of a family sharing a meal. Ordinary, except for the death dissolving in their stomachs with every passing second. She was carrying the coffee service back toward the dining room when the first scream cut through the winter evening. It was Abigail. High-pitched and sudden, a sound of such pure distress that Patience froze in the hallway outside the dining room door. The coffee pot trembled on the tray, liquid sloshing against silver. "What's wrong?" Cornelius's voice, sharp with alarm. "Abigail, what?" "I don't feel well." Abigail's words came strangled, desperate. "Something's wrong. I feel burning inside, like fire in my belly." Patience pushed open the door. The scene before her would be seared into her memory forever, a tableau of the moment when power realized its own mortality. Abigail Merrick had pushed back from the table, one hand pressed to her stomach, her face gone pale as candle wax. Across from her, Edmund Merrick had begun to sweat profusely, beads of moisture standing out on his forehead like morning dew. "I feel it too," Edmund said, his voice tight. "God," Cornelius, something's very wrong. Cornelius rose from his chair, his own face beginning to show the first signs of distress, a graying pallor, a tightness around his mouth. The food. Something in the food. Patience. He turned toward her with eyes that had gone from suspicious to terrified. What did you do? What did you put in that stew? Nothing but what I always do, master. The lie came smoothly, easily. Patience set down the coffee tray with hands that remained steady even as her own stomach began to cramp. Venison, vegetables, herbs. Margaret Merrick whimpered. The 12-year-old girl had gone white, her delicate features twisted in confusion and fear. Mama, I don't feel good. My tummy hurts. Papa, something's wrong. Young Thomas clutched his stomach, tears starting to stream down his 8-year-old face. It hurts. It hurts so much. Only William, the eldest son, remained relatively composed, though Patience could see the fear dawning in his eyes as he watched his family deteriorate around him. Father, should I ride for Dr. Pemberton? Yes. Go. Now. Cornelius's command came out as a roar, but it was undercut by a sudden doubling over as cramps seized his own abdomen. God, the pain. Abigail vomited. The sound was horrible, wet and violent, as her body attempted to expel the poison that had already entered her bloodstream. The acidic smell filled the dining room, mixing with the lingering aroma of the venison stew in a grotesque parody of the pleasant meal it had been meant to be. Edmund followed seconds later, retching onto the expensive carpet while his brother watched in horror. Margaret began to cry, soft sobs of a child who understood that something terrible was happening but not yet how terrible. Thomas screamed for his mother, his small body shaking with convulsions that came too quickly, too violently for a child who had eaten less than the adults. William ran from the room, his footsteps thundering toward the front door, toward the stables, toward help that would arrive far too late. Dr. Pemberton lived 8 miles away in Charlottesville. Even if William rode at breakneck speed through the December darkness, even if the doctor came immediately, the arsenic would have done its work long before medical intervention could matter. Patience stood in the doorway, bearing witness. This was her doing. This suffering, this terror, this slow-motion destruction of a family, she had authored it all with careful measurements of white powder and deliberate stirring of a wooden spoon. She felt no triumph. She felt no regret. She felt only the cold certainty that this was justice, however monstrous. The door to the kitchen passage burst open. Douglas Burke stormed through, his face already showing signs of distress. He had eaten the portion Samuel had delivered to the overseer's house, as Patience had planned. But Burke was younger, stronger, and he had consumed less. He would last longer, suffer more. What's happening here? Burke demanded, then his eyes landed on the scene of chaos, the vomiting, the crying children, the patriarch doubled over in agony. Sweet Jesus! Patience, what have you done? Before she could answer, Cornelius raised a shaking hand to point at her. She poisoned us. The stew. She put something in the stew. Arrest her. Chain her. Don't let her leave. Burke lunged toward Patience, but a sudden wave of nausea stopped him mid-stride. He staggered, clutching a chair back for support. You poisoned me too. You mad woman, you've killed us all. Not all, Patience said quietly. Just those who earned it. The hours that followed were a descent into hell. Patience did not flee. She did not hide. She remained in the house as other enslaved people were drawn by the screams, Samuel from the stables, old Esther who tended the household linens, James who worked the fields. They stood in doorways and corners, witnessing the death of their masters with expressions that ranged from horror to carefully concealed satisfaction. Samuel found Patience in the kitchen as she sat calmly at the work table, her own stomach cramping but not yet critically. What did you do? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. What needed doing? Patience met his eyes. I warned you to stay away. And the children? Margaret and Thomas, they're just babies. You poisoned babies? The accusation cut deeper than Patience had expected. They poisoned my baby when they sold Cleo. They poisoned every child born into slavery. I just used a different kind of poison. Samuel shook his head, grief and understanding warring across his weathered face. This won't bring her back. I know. But it balances the scales. In the dining room, Edmund Merrick died first. He convulsed violently, his body rejecting the poison even as it coursed fatally through his organs, and then went still with his eyes open and staring at the ceiling. Abigail followed within the hour, her aristocratic composure finally breaking as she begged for mercy that did not come, for relief from pain that only intensified until her heart gave out. Cornelius lasted longer, his larger body fighting the inevitable with stubborn determination. He cursed Patience with his dying breaths, swore she would hang, promised that her death would be slow and agonizing. She sat in the kitchen and listened to his rage fade into whimpers, into silence, into nothing. Burke dragged himself to the overseer's house and died there alone, vomiting blood onto the floor of the cabin where he had planned so many cruelties. Young Thomas, small and fragile, passed in his sister's arms as Margaret held him and sobbed. The boy simply stopped breathing, his poisoned body too small to withstand what he had consumed. Margaret and William survived, but they would carry the scars, physical and psychological, for whatever remained of their shortened lives. By Christmas morning, 5 of the 7 who had eaten Patience's stew were dead. The Merrick's Cradle plantation was silent except for the sound of Margaret's weeping and the winter wind rattling the shutters of a house that had become a tomb. Patience sat in her kitchen and waited for the consequence she knew would come. The house of Merrick's Cradle transformed overnight from a seat of power into a charnel house. Christmas morning dawned gray and bitter, the kind of cold that seeped through walls and settled into bones. Inside the grand plantation house, 5 bodies lay cooling in rooms that had once hosted parties and political gatherings and celebrations of Confederate gentility. Now those same rooms held only death and the lingering smell of sickness. Patience sat in her kitchen as the December light crept through the windows. Her own stomach cramped periodically, the arsenic she had consumed working its poison through her system, but the small amount she had swallowed would not kill her, only sicken her enough to add authenticity to her claim of innocence. She had calculated even this, measured even her own suffering with the precision she brought to all her cooking. The enslaved people of Merrick's Cradle moved through the morning in a state of suspended reality. They whispered to each other in the pre-dawn darkness, gathering in small clusters away from the main house, trying to comprehend what had happened and what it would mean for them. Patience could hear fragments of their conversations drifting across the frozen ground. They saying she poisoned the whole family. Master Cornelius is dead. Mrs. too. And that brother of his. Lord have mercy, the children too. Little Thomas passed. Margaret and William still breathing, but they sick as dogs. What's gonna happen to us now? That was the question that hung over them all like a sword suspended by thread. When a master died, enslaved people became property to be distributed among heirs or sold to settle debts. When a master was murdered, enslaved people became suspects subject to collective punishment. The fate of Merrick's Cradle's enslaved population now hung on how white authorities chose to assign blame and extract retribution. Samuel entered the kitchen near dawn. He looked as though he had aged a decade overnight, his face drawn and gray. "They coming," he said quietly. "William sent riders to the neighboring plantations last night. Judge Morrison's on his way from Charlottesville with the sheriff. Be here by mid-morning." Patience nodded. She had expected nothing less. The others need to stay clear of this. Make sure everyone knows, they had nothing to do with what happened. They didn't know. They couldn't have stopped it. You think white folks gonna care about that? Samuel's voice carried bitter resignation. You killed their own. They gonna want blood. Might be they take it from all of us. Then you run. All of you. Take what you can carry and run north. By the time they finish with me, you'll have a head start. I ain't running. I'm too old to start over, and I got nowhere to run to. Samuel sat heavily on the bench across from her. But the young ones, maybe. Ruth, James, little Timothy. Maybe they got a chance. They sat in silence for a moment, two people who had survived decades of bondage now facing the final accounting of resistance. Outside, the sound of horses approached, not the authorities yet, but neighbors, other plantation owners drawn by news of the massacre like vultures to carrion. By 9 o'clock, the house filled with white men in expensive coats, their faces masks of outrage and fear. Fear, Patience understood, because if one enslaved cook could murder an entire family, then every plantation owner in Virginia was vulnerable in their own homes, served by hands that might hide poison as easily as they served supper. Judge Thaddeus Morrison arrived at 10. He was a man of 60 with silver hair and a face carved from granite, a face that had sentenced countless enslaved people to whipping, sale, and execution without visible emotion. He took charge immediately, establishing himself in Cornelius Merrick's study while the bodies were carried to the parlor and laid out for examination. Patience was brought before him near noon. Two men gripped her arms, unnecessary, as she had no intention of fleeing. She stood before the judge's commandeered desk and met his eyes without lowering her gaze, a small act of defiance that made his jaw tighten. "You are Patience Thornwell, enslaved cook of this household?" "Yes, sir." "You prepared the meal eaten by the Merrick family last evening?" "Yes, sir." "And you stand accused of poisoning that meal with arsenic, resulting in the deaths of Cornelius Merrick, Abigail Merrick, Edmund Merrick, Thomas Merrick, and the overseer Douglas Burke. How do you answer this charge?" The moment stretched. Patience could deny it. She could claim ignorance, suggest the rat poison had somehow contaminated the food by accident, play the role of the simple, superstitious slave who could not possibly have conceived and executed such a plan. Some part of her knew this might even work, might at least introduce enough doubt to spare her the noose. But Patience Thornwell had not poisoned the Merrick family to save her own life. She had done it because some things mattered more than survival. "I did it," she said clearly. "I put rat poison in the stew. I measured it carefully. I stirred it in. I served it to them knowing they would die." Gasps erupted from the white men crowded into the study. Judge Morrison's face darkened. "You confess to murder." "I confess to killing slavers who sold my daughter for a crime she didn't commit. I confess to poisoning a man who raped enslaved women and called it his right. I confess to serving justice the only way a person in chains can serve it." Silence. Morrison's hand slammed the desk. "You will not speak unless questioned. You will not justify the unjustifiable. You are a murderer, and you will hang for it." "I expect I will," Patience said calmly. "But I want to know why. I want it written down that Cleo Thornwell was sold to Mississippi for a theft she never committed. That Douglas Burke planted evidence to destroy her because I wouldn't let him touch me. Cornelius Merrick signed her sale without investigation or mercy. I want those truths spoken, even if no one cares." "The truth," Morrison said coldly, "is that you are a savage who committed an act of barbarism against a civilized family. Nothing you say can justify the murder of children. You killed an 8-year-old boy." The accusation struck like a physical blow. Patience felt her composure crack for the first time. "They killed my daughter. Maybe not with poison, but they killed her just the same. Sent her to a cotton field where girls don't live to see 20. What's the difference between poison and cotton? Both murder children. I just did it faster and called it by its right name." Morrison stood, his face rigid with fury. "Remove her. Put her in chains. The trial will be held tomorrow in Charlottesville. I expect it will last approximately 1 hour." As the men dragged her from the study, Patience caught sight of Margaret Merrick in the hallway. The 12-year-old girl sat wrapped in blankets, pale and trembling from the poison that had nearly killed her. Their eyes met. Margaret's face showed no hatred, no anger, only a terrible, bewildered grief that cut deeper than any accusation. "I'm sorry," Patience whispered, surprised to find she meant it. Not sorry for killing the girl's parents. Not sorry for the act itself. But sorry that children had to suffer for the sins of their fathers, sorry that the cycle of violence and retribution had caught an innocent in its teeth. Margaret said nothing. She simply looked away. They chained Patience in what had been the smokehouse, a small brick building at the edge of the plantation grounds. The chains were heavy, the iron cold against her wrists and ankles. Through the small window, she could see the main house where she had worked for 15 years, where she had raised her daughter, where she had committed the act that would end her life. Other enslaved people came in small groups as the afternoon wore on. They brought her water, a blanket, words of comfort or condemnation depending on their own feelings about what she had done. Ruth came, crying, saying she didn't understand why Patience had sent her away. James came, silent and solemn, pressing a small piece of corn bread into her hand. Old Esther came and prayed over her, asking God for mercy on her soul. Samuel came last, as evening fell and the guards changed. He sat outside the smokehouse door where they could talk through the barred window. "William and Margaret gonna survive," he said quietly. "Doctor says they'll recover, though William's got damage to his innards that'll trouble him the rest of his life." Good. Patience meant it. She had not wanted to kill children, even if she had accepted it as a necessary consequence. Knowing 2 survived eased something in her chest. "They're gonna hang you fast. Tomorrow, maybe the day after." "I know. Was it worth it?" Patience considered the question. Was vengeance worth her life? Was the death of slavers worth the death of children? Was justice, however dark and terrible, worth the price it demanded? "Ask me after they put the rope around my neck," she said finally. "Maybe I'll know by then." But she suspected she already did. She thought of Cleo, 600 miles away, possibly still alive, possibly already worked to death in Mississippi fields. She thought of her daughter's face, her daughter's voice, her daughter's small hand in hers as they kneaded bread in the pre-dawn kitchen that now seemed like something from another lifetime. If Cleo lived, she would hear what her mother had done. She would know that Patience Thornwell had loved her enough to kill for her, to die for her, to damn her own soul if necessary to balance the cosmic scales that had stolen a child from her mother's arms. And perhaps, Patience thought as the winter stars emerged above Virginia, that would be enough. Subscribe now for more dark tales from America's haunted past. Share your thoughts in the comments below. January 7, 1840. Charlottesville, Virginia. The gallows stood in the courthouse square, temporary but sturdy, built for the specific purpose of executing Patience Thornwell. The trial had been brief, as Judge Morrison promised, less than 2 hours from opening statements to verdict. The all-white jury deliberated for 7 minutes before pronouncing her guilty of murder. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out with all deliberate speed. Patience stood on the platform in the gray morning light, her hands bound before her, a rough hemp noose around her neck. Below, a crowd had gathered, plantation owners and their families, townspeople eager for the spectacle, enslaved people forced to witness as a warning against resistance. The January cold bit through her thin dress, but she barely felt it. She had moved beyond physical sensation into a place of strange calm. The magistrate read the charges and the sentence in a droning voice that carried across the square. Patience didn't listen. Instead, she looked out over the crowd, searching for familiar faces. She found Samuel near the back, his weathered face creased with sorrow. She found Ruth, weeping openly. She found others from Merrick's Cradle, their expressions ranging from grief to fear to carefully hidden approval. She did not find Cleo. Of course she didn't. Cleo was in Mississippi, unreachable, perhaps already dead herself in the cotton fields that devoured young bodies like fuel for the machine of slavery. "Have you any last words?" the magistrate asked. Patience turned to face him. The crowd fell silent, waiting for her to beg for mercy, to confess her sins, to validate their worldview by groveling before the justice of white authority. She gave them none of it. "Tell my daughter I loved her," Patience said, her voice clear and strong. "That's all. Just tell her I loved her." The magistrate nodded to the executioner. The hood came down over Patience's face, blocking out the world. She heard the creak of wood, felt the platform shift beneath her feet. And then she was falling. The drop was short. Her neck did not break cleanly. For long seconds, an eternity, she strangled at the end of the rope, her body convulsing, her lungs screaming for air that would not come. The crowd watched in silence as Patience Thornwell died the slow, agonizing death that Virginia law prescribed for enslaved people who killed their masters. When her body finally went still, they left her hanging for 3 hours as a warning. Afterward, she was cut down and buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the cemetery, in the section reserved for criminals and slaves, far from the respectable white dead. The story should have ended there. It didn't. Merrick's Cradle plantation stood empty by the spring of 1840. Margaret and William Merrick survived the poisoning but were forever changed. William suffered chronic digestive ailments that left him weak and prone to illness. Margaret developed a nervous condition that manifested in nightmares and sudden fits of terror. Neither child could bear to remain in the house where their family had died. The plantation passed to a distant Merrick cousin in Richmond who had no interest in maintaining the property. He sold off the enslaved people at auction. Samuel went to a tobacco plantation in North Carolina, Ruth to a household in Richmond, the others scattered across Virginia like seeds on barren ground. The main house was locked and shuttered, the fields left fallow, the entire property abandoned to decay. By 1842, strange reports began to circulate among the neighboring plantations. Travelers passing Merrick's Cradle on the main road claimed to see lights in the kitchen windows late at night, though the house stood empty and locked. Some reported the smell of cooking food, venison and herbs, specifically, drifting across the grounds despite no fires burning in the cold hearths. A family from Alexandria attempted to purchase the property in 1843. They lasted 3 nights in the main house before fleeing, refusing to speak of what they had experienced beyond vague references to a presence in the kitchen and the sound of someone weeping. Local enslaved people, when pressed, shared whispered stories. "A woman in the kitchen," they said. Dark-skinned, wearing a stained apron, standing over a pot that steamed despite containing nothing. She hummed work songs in the pre-dawn hours. She stirred the empty air with a wooden spoon. She never spoke, never acknowledged those who saw her, simply continued her eternal cooking, preparing a meal that would never be served. Some claimed they heard 2 voices in the kitchen, a woman's and a young girl's, talking softly, laughing occasionally, the sounds of a mother and daughter sharing the intimate space of their work. But when investigators entered, they found nothing but dust and decay. The Civil War came to Virginia in 1861. Union soldiers occupied Merrick's Cradle briefly in 1863, using the abandoned buildings as a temporary camp. Multiple soldiers reported encounters that defied explanation. Private Henry Cartwright of the Massachusetts 54th wrote in his journal, "We found the kitchen intact despite years of abandonment. That night, 3 of us saw a Negro woman standing by the hearth, stirring a pot. She wore clothing from decades past and paid us no mind. When we approached, she simply vanished, though the smell of cooking remained for hours after." Sergeant William Dobbs reported, "I entered the kitchen seeking shelter from the rain and found it impossibly warm, as though fires burned in the hearth, though no flames were visible. A woman stood with her back to me. I called out. She turned, and her eyes held such sorrow and rage that I fled like a child from nightmares. I am not a superstitious man, but I know what I saw. That house is cursed." The Union soldiers abandoned Merrick's Cradle after a week, despite its strategic location. Official records cite structural instability, but private letters and journals tell a different story, of sleepless nights filled with the sounds of cooking, of phantom smells that induced nausea, of an overwhelming sense of grief and anger that permeated the very walls. By 1870, the main house had partially collapsed. The roof caved in, windows shattered, walls crumbled. Nature reclaimed the plantation, vines crawled up the brick, trees pushed through floorboards, animals nested in the ruins. But the kitchen, strangely, remained largely intact. The hearth stood solid. The iron hook still hung from the ceiling. The work table, though weathered, held its shape. And the reports continued. Local children dared each other to approach the ruins at night. Those who did returned with stories of a woman visible through the kitchen windows, always cooking, always stirring, trapped in an eternal repetition of her final act of resistance. In 1889, 50 years after the massacre, a journalist from Richmond visited the site to write a feature on the haunted kitchen of Albemarle County. He spent a night in the ruins and emerged shaken, his notebook filled with observations that his editor refused to publish. She is not merely a ghost. She is rage given form, grief made manifest. She cooks her poison stew eternally, serving justice to masters who can no longer die. The smell of venison filled my nostrils until I retched. I heard her voice, not words, but humming, a work song from slavery times. And beneath it, a younger voice, a girl, singing harmony. Mother and daughter, reunited in death, bound to this place by the violence that separated them in life. The 20th century brought skepticism and science, but it did not diminish the stories. Paranormal investigators visited Merrick's Cradle throughout the 1900s. Some reported electromagnetic anomalies. Others claimed to capture voices on recording devices, a woman's voice saying, "This is for Cleo," and a girl's voice responding, "I know, Mama. I know." Margaret Merrick died in Richmond in 1841, exactly 1 year after the poisoning, from typhoid. She was 13. William Merrick lived longer but not well. He suffered seizures attributed to the arsenic poisoning and drowned in the Rivanna River in 1847 at age 23. The official ruling was accidental death, though some who knew him suspected otherwise. The Merrick line, at least this branch, ended with him. The land that had been Merrick's Cradle changed hands multiple times but was never successfully developed. Every attempt to build on the property failed: construction accidents, financial troubles, workers who refused to return after experiencing unexplained phenomena. By 1950, it was designated as historically significant ruins and left to decay in peace. Today, what remains of Merrick's Cradle sits overgrown and forgotten on a rural road in Albemarle County. The main house is gone, collapsed into its own foundation. The slave quarters have vanished. The fields have returned to forest. But the kitchen foundation remains. In 2019, a team of historians and archaeologists excavated the site, hoping to learn more about daily life on antebellum plantations. Among the rubble and earth, they found artifacts, broken pottery, rusted utensils, fragments of glass. And in what had been the hearth, they found a cast iron pot, large and heavy, designed for cooking stews and soups for large households. The pot should have been rusted beyond recognition after 180 years of exposure to the elements. Instead, it was pristine, black and smooth as the day it was forged. When the lead archaeologist lifted it, she reported that it felt warm to the touch despite sitting in cold earth. And it smelled, impossibly, of venison and herbs. The pot was removed to a university laboratory for study. Researchers found trace elements of arsenic in the iron, quantities that should not have persisted for nearly 2 centuries. They found organic residue that defied carbon dating, returning results that made no scientific sense. 3 members of the research team reported dreams after handling the pot, dreams of a woman cooking in a kitchen lit by firelight, of a young girl standing beside her learning the craft, of love and loss and terrible vengeance. The pot was eventually returned to the site and reburied where it was found. Because some objects, like some stories, refuse to be contained. Some acts of resistance burn so intensely that they scar themselves permanently into the physical world. And some loves, a mother's love for her stolen daughter, transcend even death, existing in the liminal space between history and haunting, between justice and horror, between the living and the dead. At Merrick's Cradle, on certain December nights when the wind blows cold across the Virginia Piedmont, those who dare to visit the ruins report the same phenomena that have been reported for 180 years, the smell of cooking food, the sound of humming, the faint glow of firelight where no fire burns. And if you stand very still and listen very carefully, you might hear two voices, a woman's and a girl's, singing together in the darkness, reunited at last in the only place they both knew as home, cooking together for eternity in a kitchen built on suffering but transformed by love into something that death itself cannot erase. The Merricks are long forgotten. Their names mean nothing. Their legacy is dust. But Patience Thornwell and Cleo remain, bound to the earth that witnessed their separation, claiming in death the togetherness that slavery denied them in life. Some call it a haunting. Others call it justice. Perhaps it's both, a reminder that the sins of slavery echo still, that the violence of that peculiar institution reverberates across centuries, and that some acts of resistance, however dark, burn bright enough to light the way through history's longest nights. If this story sent chills down your spine, smash that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What other dark tales from history should we uncover next?